1996. The horror genre is dead. The slasher genre is deader. The shambling corpses of once beloved icons have milked their cash cows dry and weakly farted out what seemed to be their final films. A new kid on the block that seemed to have a promising start has already started to falter critically, more than halving its box office takings just 2 sequels later. And a sincere attempt to reinvigorate a franchise star fell short of commercial expectations. Horror has had its 80s heyday, but studios are starting to think the party's over and it's time to go home. And then, out of nowhere, a ghost-faced masked villain kicks down the door, kegs of beer under each arm, and announces the party's just begun. And 25 years later, just having had its anniversary, it still runs a fun party. This is Scream. It is impossible to overstate just how incredibly important Scream was to the horror and slasher genre. It didn't just make a big critical and commercial splash, it literally made horror cool again. With a couple of notable exceptions that came mostly very early in the decade, like People Under the Stairs, Candyman, and Misery to name some, the 90s was an absolute desolate wasteland for horror films, especially when compared to the 80s boom in the genre we'd just had the decade prior. It wasn't that horror wasn't getting made at all, and new franchises were churning out with moderate cult appreciation, but come on, when the 80s gave us titles like The Lost Boys, The Shining, The Fly, Gremlins, Evil Dead 2, Aliens, Poltergeist, Hellraiser, Child's Play, and introduced us to the American icons of Freddy and Jason, it's really not looking good when we get halfway into the 90s and what do we have so far? Leprechaun? Hideaway? Jason Goes to Hell? And don't get me wrong, the 80s had its fair share of middling and crap stuff too. It's just that it had so many heavy hitters to offset that balance. Whereas the first 5 years of the 90s had maybe one standout title a year, and the rest was at best alright, and at worst, just proper rubbish. Scream changed all of that. A hot ticket script from the word go, Scream was the brainchild of screenwriter Kevin Williamson, although at that stage its working title was simply Scary Movie. This would be Kevin's first film to actually get made. He had previously sold a script called Killing Mrs. Tingle that generated a lot of buzz at the time and was picked up by a studio in 1995, but then was shelved. With only one sold script to his name that looked like it was never going to see the light of day, Kevin was desperate to get something out there with his name attached that people could actually know him for, especially since the money from Mrs. Tingle didn't last him long and he was fast becoming broke. The idea for Scream came when, while house sitting for a friend, Kevin managed to scare himself. It was late at night. He was staying in somewhat unfamiliar surroundings. He was alone, and the TV had started to play murder documentaries. Freaked out and looking for something to ground him, Kevin called another friend and the two got talking. The topic? Favourite scary movies. And anyone who has ever seen Scream will understand why this was the light bulb moment. Retreating to an undisturbed room, Kevin blasted out Scream in either just 3 or 30 solid days, depending on who you ask, handed it into his agents, and a bidding war immediately started over the script that saw Kevin's life changing when he was handed a $400,000 check by winning studio Dimension Films, a newer offshoot studio of Miramax that focused on genre pieces. The film moved quickly into pre-production and they were keen to get a big-name horror director attached, but several turned it down, including guys like George Romero, Sam Raimi, and even their first choice, who would eventually go on to become the film's director, Wes Craven. You see, Wes was keen to get out of horror, having felt uneasy for a while at the misogyny that plagued a lot of the genre, including his own work. Though obviously a legend in the genre himself, he wasn't sure he wanted to keep contributing to films that seemed to celebrate violence against women. And the iconic opening scene in the script that saw a young woman threatened, stalked, and killed by an unknown caller initially rubbed him the wrong way. When the studio told him they had gotten Drew Barrymore attached, he considered the job a little more, having been surprised that such a big star would want to do a script such as this, but it still wasn't enough to convince him. In the end though, as Craven tells in the documentary Scream, The Inside Story, the thing that got him to take the job was a sassy 12-year-old. One day at a convention, some little kid told him that he should do a real kick-ass film again because lately his movies had gone soft, a conscious effort on Craven's part to tone down his films. It was this small interaction that made Craven realise that of his body of work, the stuff that really resonated with people was the stuff that was more uncompromising, and this was all the kick in the arse he needed to decide to do Scream. So, whoever that little 12-year-old was, if you're out there, if you're watching this somehow, let me just say, well fucking done, you literally changed the face of horror forever by being a bit cheeky to Wes Craven, you absolute mad lad. Shockingly though, they almost lost Wes again when production hit a big roadblock that later on turned out to be one of its biggest blessings, when at the last minute, just 6 weeks before shooting began, Drew Barrymore changed her mind. Originally supposed to play the main role, Barrymore decided that she liked the opening scene so much that she wanted to play the girl killed in that introductory sequence. What felt like a fatal blow for the film, relegating its most bankable name to a minor position, actually turned out to be one of its biggest strengths. It was actually Drew Barrymore herself who argued that this would be a smart move, as they could still heavily advertise her role in the film, and everyone would think that since the film opens on her and she's obviously the biggest star, that she'd obviously survive the whole runtime. Then, when those expectations were subverted, it would set it up for the audience that anything could happen. Which is such a perfect opening sentiment for Scream because that's its entire central conceit. This is exactly what makes Scream so special. In a genre that had come to be defined by played out tropes and paint by the numbers storytelling, Scream understood that slasher audiences had grown smart, and then it dared to be smarter. It's an extremely simple premise, but one that shockingly had never really been done before. A horror movie made for and starring people who have seen horror films. Kevin Williamson adored horror and slasher movies, and he wrote a script that featured characters just like him. The teens of Scream are probably the most media literate slasher cast to ever exist. They know the tropes, they know the conventions, they understand the assignment, and they're all probably gonna die anyway. It's like a direct challenge to every armchair critic who has sat through a slasher, rolled their eyes and said, well, I'd never do that, or so she's gonna die now, or this is just like that other film, to let the room know how clever they are. Scream gives those people all the breadcrumbs and clues they need to think they've figured it all out, and then pulls the rug from under them. Everything an audience could say about the film, the characters in the movie say out loud themselves. They speculate over who the killer will be. They vocally discuss the horror movie rules. They reference other films. They complain about tropes. In essence, they're real teenagers. This film had an unparalleled finger on the pulse sensibility when it came to American teens. After sitting through the likes of the Kumbaya singing camp counselors of Friday the 13th, or any of the equally copy and paste how do you do fellow kid casts that filled out slasher movie sequels for years, Scream's teens feel like a huge breath of fresh air. They're knowledgeable, grounded, flawed, likeable and smart. It's like a John Hughes cast managed to accidentally stumble into a slasher flick. After opening on the aforementioned incredible scene-setting killing of Drew Barrymore, which could honestly just be a successful horror short film in its own right, the film follows Sydney, a young woman dealing with the trauma of her mother's murder a year prior, who has old wounds made fresh again when this new killer rises up in town and draws comparisons to the events surrounding her mother. Sydney quickly finds that the similarities between these new killings and that traumatic day may not be merely incidental, as she finds herself and friends become new targets for this ghost-faced cheap costume store killer who repeatedly attacks and taunts them with a consistent focus on Sydney. With no idea who the man behind the mask is and his presence being a constant threat that can surface at almost any time, it's up to Sydney to keep her guard up, dodge a pushy tabloid press presence in anchorwoman Gail Weathers, who is writing a book about these events and Sydney's mother's death, and survive until this killer is captured, all the while trying to solve the mystery the police can't, as she speculates with her friends as to who the man behind the mask could be while the bodies pile up around them. Throw in some teen issues like relationship troubles and dealing with gossip and rumours surrounding her terribly sensationalised life, then finish on a horror house party finale that's so big, so full of twists and turns and spectacular set pieces that it takes up over 40 minutes of the film's runtime and took such a painfully exhausting 21 dusk till dawn nights to shoot that the entire crew got t-shirts saying they survived filming the scene, and you've got yourself Scream. And when you sum it up like that, it probably doesn't sound anything special, right? Just your standard slasher. Masked killer, teen targets, a definitive final girl, it's all very familiar territory. But it's in what Scream does with the journey over these well-treaded grounds that makes it so special. It's suspenseful. The threat never lets up, constantly lurking in the background or jumping out to attack in the light of day. It's twisty as hell. The film says it best itself. Everyone is a suspect. There's red herrings on top of red herrings on top of red herrings. I'm consciously choosing not to talk about its amazing finale, even though I go into spoilers a lot on this show, just on the off chance none of you have seen it, because you really need to experience how it plays out firsthand. It's amazingly acted. Every single person in this movie has been cast flawlessly. Neve Campbell is a believably troubled lead. Courtney Cox's Gale Weathers is fantastically awful as the blood-chasing, fame-hungry reporter. Drew Barrymore's short stint still ends up being a 5-star performance that never leaves your memory. Rose McGowan offers a great best friend for Sydney to bounce off. Professional wrestling legend and former WCW World Champion David Arquette brings fantastic heart to the piece, feeling almost intentionally out of place as a kind of "aw shucks" in over his head deputy, at contrast with the smart-mouthed teens. Jamie Kennedy's Randy is such a perfect little pretentious dork. Everybody who has ever even been in the vicinity of a conversation on film knows a Randy. Skeet Ulrich makes for an irritatingly handsome and charismatic love interest. Like, fuck you, dude. Fuck you for looking like that, and fuck you for having such an attractive air of mystery to you. Not fair. Leave some sexiness for the rest of the world. I swear if this film had been made today, Twitter and TikTok would be plagued with fan cams made of montages of clips of this character here. Roger Jackson as the voice of Ghostface is phenomenally menacing. On set, Craven didn't let the other actors see who was doing the voice so they could imagine the most fearsome person on the other end of the calls. And they must have had an easy job thinking of someone terrifying, because that voice is chilling. And my absolute favourite performance of them all, a shining star that stands out even amongst a sea of already shining stars, Matthew Lillard Stew. The playful, kinda dorky, kinda douchey best friend of Skeet's Billy is the absolute best. I swear to God. Some people say he's too over the top, but nah. Totally disagree. He gives it 1,000,000% and he is absolutely pitch perfect. It's pure gold. It's one of the single most entertaining performances of anything ever. This film is excellent. There are so many moments of inspired genius here. Like, if I ever write something as cleverly metatextual as Jamie Kennedy's character watching Halloween and screaming at Jamie Lee Curtis, "Look behind you, Jamie! Jamie! Jamie, behind you!" as the audience watching are saying the exact same thing to him, then I'm gonna become insufferably arrogant, because that shit is genius. The whole film is genius. Its pace is spot on. Its performances knock it out the park. The dialogue is tight, the concept original and refreshing. It is no wonder that this became the new template for horror that spawned a sea of homages and rip-offs and influenced decades of future filmmakers afterwards. Films as recent as this year, 25 years after its release, are still making nods to it. Scream is that important and influential. Quite frankly, it's just a phenomenal piece of work. In fact, you know what? It's not just phenomenal, it's perfect. I'm officially adding it to the small collection of movies I've covered this month that I can file under perfect. Sure, I can make the very small complaint that one of the characters isn't really mourned when perhaps they should be, but even that I'm not sure counts as a flaw, because any additions to this film would ruin its spot-on pacing. There's not a second of runtime in this film wasted. And as if it couldn't get any more perfect, it also has my personal favourite instance of pettiness ever. As right at the end of the special thanks section of the film's credits reads, "No thanks whatsoever to the Santa Rosa City School District Governing Board, who voted to kick them out of a high school they had a contract to use during production." Brilliant. That's not my favourite credit in the film though. My favourite one has a bit of a story behind it. So apparently, when making the movie, the script just said, "a ghostly white mask." And the filmmakers had absolutely no idea what that looked like, but it was their job to interpret what that meant. They tried a bunch of different masks, but all the designs they went through just didn't work. Now obviously, we all know in the end what they settled on, that iconic drooping face reminiscent of Edvard Munch's The Scream. But how did they settle on this? Well, it turns out they just found it. When doing a location scout on an old house, producer Marianne Madalena, as if by fate, literally just stumbled upon the mask in one of the bedrooms. She asked the owner what it was, and apparently her husband collected masks and she had no idea where he got it. They asked to borrow the mask and Wes just instantly fell in love with it. Problem was, they didn't own it and they had no idea who did. So they decided to tweak it to avoid copyright, but every modification they did just made it look wrong. It was literally just perfect in its unedited form. Against his better judgment, Wes decided to shoot a whole day using this mystery mask, worrying the whole time that he was going to get the studio sued and never work again if they couldn't track the source of this thing down. Luckily, they eventually found it was an in-house product of a little mom and pop joint called Fun World. They called the owner and asked if they could use it in a movie, and he said, "Sure, just send $100 and put our company name in the credits." And there you have it. Look at that. Cinema history on a fluke find and $100 deal. Bargain. Also, another bit of fun trivia, the film had a nightmare trying to release with an R rating as the MPAA kept certifying it with NC-17, which would have been a kiss of death for the film. And seemingly no edits they were willing to compromise on was able to lower that rating until Dimension Films head Bob Weinstein called them up and told them it was a comedy. He basically argued that because it was a comedy, the intense stuff should be viewed with a lens of comedic context, and that it's all parody and spoof, as gory as it might be, and they agreed to lower the age rating. Wes even joked after it worked that he was going to say that every film he made after Scream was a comedy. I couldn't find a way to shoehorn this story into the rest of the video, so you're getting it here. But actually, the fact that Bob could argue this case is testament to how great Scream's tone, characters, and subversions of horror tropes are. It might be an excellent slasher film, but it's also excellent satire. And between that, the petty credit call out, and the hilarious rating system bluff that actually somehow paid off, how can you not celebrate this movie? An instant classic. Even if you've watched it and don't like it, you can't deny its importance to the industry and genre as a whole. And if you haven't seen it, what are you waiting for? It's the 25th anniversary. There is literally never a better time to watch it. Now sod off and go enjoy that absolute masterpiece. Although if you're gonna sod off, please do it after liking, commenting and subscribing to my Only Dance at the red button below and hitting the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's video. And you know, if you really enjoyed the show and you're feeling super generous and would like to support the channel, then you can become a patron at the Patreon link in the video description for some cool exclusives. And then once you've done that, you can sod off. You know, after all that stuff. Then you can sod off and watch Scream. Anyway, that's all from me today. But don't sod off for too long, because I'll be back again to look at Scream 2. Until then, I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season, and I will see you tomorrow.